Wyoming Territory, 1881. The sky is the color of a bruise healing wrong, gray at the edges, darker at the center. The kind of sky that doesn't threaten, it promises. A trail cuts through frozen grassland, straight and indifferent as a scar. The wagon tracks pressed into the earth by 100 journeys before this one. Wind moves through brittle brown grass, bending it east, always east. A single wagon, moving not slow. Behind it, growing smaller in the trail dust, a figure. Standing, a girl alone, one gray blanket pressed against her chest, no pack, no weapon. Nothing but the coat on her back and something tucked inside it, close against her ribs, that no one on that wagon knew she carried. The wagon does not stop. She does not call after it. She turns, faces the mountains. The cold coming off those peaks is not weather. It is a judgment. And somewhere inside that coat, pressed against the only warmth she has left, 4 pages that are about to change everything. The wagon never slowed. That was the thing Adeline Vance would carry longest. Not the cold that followed, not the hunger, not the nights when her body shook so hard her teeth became percussion instruments marking time against the dark. What she would carry was the absence of hesitation. No pause in the creak of iron-rimmed wheels. No moment where her father's shoulders turned, where the canvas flap moved, where one of her 2 younger sisters pressed a face against the white cloth to watch her shrink in the distance. The wagon simply continued, the way water continues downhill, the way November continues toward December, without consultation and without regret. Cornelius Vance was not a man who raised his voice for important things. He saved volume for small provocations, a spilled coffee tin, a mended seam pulled loose too soon, a child's laughter at the wrong hour. For the large decisions he moved in silence, with the particular economy of a man who had long ago concluded that the world owed him explanations he would never receive. He had climbed down from the bench that morning without announcement. He had walked to the rear of the wagon, with his shoulders set in that way. Adeline recognized the way an animal recognizes weather, not through thought, but through the body's older intelligence. He had pulled back the canvas flap. His eyes, the pale gray of river ice in late January, had found her face with no detectable search. He had taken hold of the collar of her coat, the brown wool one her mother had patched at the elbows 3 years before her mother died, and he had pitched her into the road the way a man disposes of something that has begun to smell. A gray blanket landed beside her a moment later. She never knew who threw it. Perhaps one of her sisters. Perhaps the wind caught it from somewhere in the wagon's dark interior. She picked it up because it was there, because her hands moved before her mind gave them instruction, because the body has its own opinions about survival that operate beneath the level of grief. She pressed it against her chest. She stood, her legs held. She brushed dust from her skirt, with fingers already going numb at the tips, and she turned and looked at the country around her. The date was November 14, 1881. The place was the Powder River Trail in Wyoming Territory, where the valley cut between the Bighorn foothills to the west and the long brown plains rolling east toward the Nebraska line. The sky held the color of old pewter. The grass along the ruts had gone brittle with the first hard frosts, and the wind coming down off the mountains carried a temperature that promised worse by nightfall. The nearest settlement was a place called Clearwater Crossing, 41 miles to the northeast. Most men found alone on the high plains in mid-November did not last 3 days. Adeline Vance was not most men. She was not any kind of man at all, which her father had spent the last two years treating as a sufficiency of character rather than a simple fact of biology. She was 16 years old, 5 feet 4 inches, with hands that had spent her whole life in kitchens and wagon beds rather than at plows or axe handles, and she had one watching. That was the thing Cornelius Vance had never understood and never would, that his daughter, sitting quiet in the corner while the men talked cattle and the women talked Pennsylvania, and the children drew pictures in the dust with sticks, had been watching everything with the focused attention of someone who understood at a bone leap level that information was the only currency she was ever going to be allowed to earn. She had watched the wheelwright on their wagon train from Nebraska press a green ash splint against a cracked axle and bind it with iron heated to color sunset. She had watched the way the trail boss read morning clouds by their height and texture rather than their color. She had watched a family from Minnesota build their first prairie shelter from Kutsatsad, laying the heavy, grass-rooted squares the way a mason lays brick, course by patient course. Most of all, for 6 months on the trail, she had watched a man named Gustav Brenner. Brenner was somewhere past 70, an immigrant master mason who had come to Wyoming territory 2 years before the Vance wagon train passed through, carrying knowledge that the western frontier had not yet developed the humility to want. His hands were the color and texture of old saddle leather. His beard was the dirty white of sheep's wool after a wet spring. Every evening when the wagons circled and the cook fires came up, Brenner would find a clear patch of ground near the flames and begin to draw with his finger in the dust. And the shapes he drew were always the same: a rectangular box at floor level, feeding into a series of channels that moved smoke horizontally through stone before releasing it skyward. He called it a masonry heater. He called it the most efficient warming device ever built by human hands, capable of storing the heat of a single 2-hour fire in the thermos and radiating that stored warmth for 18 hours or more after the last ember died. The other men on the wagon train listened for a minute or two, and then found better things to do. The women drifted back to their cooking pots. The children used Brenner's carefully drawn diagrams as targets for pebble throwing competitions. The old mason continued drawing and explaining to the firelit air with the patience of a man who had stopped expecting to be heard without losing the conviction that the speaking still mattered. Adeline sat in the dust 3 feet from his elbow every night he drew. Knees pulled up under her chin resting on her knees, eyes on his finger moving through the dust. When her father ordered her to bed, she went, and when she was certain the wagon went quiet, she lit a candle stub no thicker than her finger, and she opened the family Bible to the blank pages in the back, the printer's pages, the ones her father had never looked at because they contained nothing he wanted to know, and she copied what Brenner had drawn. The firebox dimensions, the serpentine channel layout, the ratios of cross-section that governed how well the smoke would move, the numbers he muttered under his breath like prayers. 2 feet wide at the firebox mouth, 18 inches tall, 1 square foot of chimney exit, 15 feet of vertical rise. She filled 4 pages in careful charcoal lines, so fine they might have been drawn by a drafting instrument. She told no one, not her sisters, who would have told their father out of a misplaced sense of family loyalty, not Brenner himself, who would have been moved in ways she did not know how to navigate. She simply sat and copied and said nothing, storing knowledge the way the stone in Brenner's drawings stored heat, quietly, invisibly, against a need that had not yet arrived. The Bible had been thrown from the wagon with her. It lay against her ribs now inside the wool coat, its spine pressing a thin rectangle of warmth into her left side where the wind could not reach it. Her father had disposed of his daughter, and had not known he was handing her the only thing that fit the lock she was about to spend a winter trying to open. Adeline understood this with a clarity that did not feel like triumph. It felt more like the cold, simply a condition of the landscape that she would have to account for in every calculation from this point forward. She walked toward the line of cottonwoods to the west. Where wagon trains carved their roads, they followed water, and water meant life in a country that otherwise offered very little of it. She found the creek as the sun began to angle toward the western peaks. It ran clear and fast over a bed of dark round stones, spring-fetched at its source somewhere high in the Big Horn, cold enough that her hand went fully numb after 3 seconds submerged. She drank until her stomach ached. She followed the bank downstream until she found what she needed: an overhang of earth and exposed roots cut into the bank by years of seasonal flooding, perhaps 4 feet deep and 6 feet wide. Not shelter in any meaningful sense. An idea of shelter, stripped of everything but its basic geometry. She gathered deadfall branches until her arms shook with the weight of the loads, piling them along the open face of the cut bank until the wall of interlocked wood was thick enough to redirect the wind if not stop it. The work warmed her. The warmth was deceptive. She knew from watching trail hands that warmth produced by exertion masked the degree to which the body was losing heat to the air around it, and that the danger came in the hour after the work stopped. She kept moving until she had no choice but to stop. She crawled into the cut bank. She wrapped the gray blanket over her coat and over her head and tucked her knees against her chest. She closed her eyes. The cold found her anyway, the way it always finds its way through whatever barrier a person builds. Not through malice, but through the simple physics of differential temperature, patient and methodical, and completely indifferent to what it was doing to the creature inside the coat. Her fingers went numb first, then her toes, then her face, until she could feel her own breath only by the faint warmth it deposited on the wool wrapped across her mouth before the wind stole even that. Her body began to shake. She counted. It was something her mother had taught her, or rather something she had absorbed from watching her mother in the year before the lung sickness took her, the way Margaret Vance moved through fear by putting her attention on specific numbers rather than on the shapeless fact of being afraid. Adeline counted to 1,000. She started again. She counted the wagons in the train she had been traveling with. 11. She counted the nights she had helped her mother make supper in a cabin in Nebraska before her mother's breathing changed. Too many to count, so she started from the beginning and counted more carefully. She counted the times her father had told her she was a disappointment in terms she was not supposed to understand, but did. She stopped at counting that one because it had no ceiling she had ever found. She thought about her mother instead. Margaret Vance had been a Shawnee woman from Ohio, and the word Shawnee had not been spoken in the Vance household after the wedding, and especially not after Margaret died, as though grief and inheritance operated under the same rules of concealment her father applied to everything that made him uncomfortable. What Adeline remembered was not her mother's ancestry, but her mother's hands, strong, quick, always solving something, and her voice saying once beside a frozen rain barrel in Nebraska, "The cold is not your enemy. The cold is just the cold. Your enemy is the part of you that wants to lie down." Adeline did not lie down. When the gray light of early morning finally moved into the eastern sky, she crawled out of the cut bank on her hands and knees. She stood. Her legs worked after a fashion. Her shoulders felt as though she had been beaten with a fence post. She was alive, which was the first problem solved, and the fact of being alive meant she now had to address a second problem, which was that she could not sue only for food. She spent that first full day studying the land within a mile of the cutbank. She walked the creek upstream until she found a pool deep enough that fish might shelter through winter. She noted the standing dead pines on the slope above, dry fuel if she could find a way to make fire. She followed game trails through the brush and found fresh sign that elk were still moving through the valley. She found something else, an outcrop of pale sandstone exposed where the slope had sheared away, the rock breaking into flat rectangular slabs when she pried at the edges with a stout stick. She stood looking at those slabs for a long time, and other girl kept walking. Adeline stood and thought about thermal mass. She found no flint that day or the next or the one after that. She tried the friction methods she had seen farm boys attempt in Nebraska, the bow drill, the hand drill. But those were techniques that required dry wood, dry hands, strong calloused palms, and hours of practice she did not yet have. She tried anyway. She tried until her palms bled, and the pieces of wood she was working against were dark with effort, and the only smoke she produced was the smoke of her own frustration rising into air that did not care. On the fifth day, she found salvation in the ruts. It was a piece of broken glass, the curved bottom of a bottle, lying half buried in the frozen weasel tracks the wagon trains had pressed into the soil over months of passage. It looked like trash because it was trash, and she very nearly stepped over. What stopped her was a memory so specific and sensory that it arrived more as physical experience than as thought. Her mother, kneeling behind their cabin in Nebraska, holding a broken jar lid up to the August sun, showing Adeline the way curved glass could gather light and focus it into a point smaller than a pinhead that could, given enough patience, convince dry material to become fire. She carried the glass back to the cut bank. She pulled the driest cottonwood bark she could find into a soft nest of fiber. She knelt in a patch of afternoon sun that was already thinning toward the western peaks. She held the curved glass above the nest and moved it in slow fractions of an inch until a bright, trembling point of focused light appeared on the fiber below. She did not move for 3 hours. She had never been tested for stillness before, not truly, not in any way that had actual consequences. She had been required to be quiet and to be patient and to stay in her place, but those were forms of suppression rather than discipline, and they did not teach the particular stillness she needed now, a stillness that required every muscle to participate simultaneously in the act of holding the glass at exactly the same angle relative to exactly the same point. while the sun moved incrementally across the sky and she moved with it, so gradually that from a distance she would have appeared not to move at all. The sun crept. She crept. A small brown spot darkened in the nest of bark fiber. A thread of smoke rose, thinner than a hair. She stopped breathing. The thread thickened. Then a single orange ember opened in the heart of the nest, small and perfect like an eye waking up. She bent her face to it. She breathed on it with the gentleness her mother had used when waking sleeping children. Not a blast, but a sustained exhalation, warm and steady, feeding oxygen to something that had not yet decided whether it wanted to live. Her head went light. The world at the edges of her vision went soft. The ember deepened and spread, and a small yellow flame reached upward. And Adeline fed it cottonwood bark, and then a twig, and then another twig. And she made fire for the first time in 5 days. She put her face very close to the flame, and she wept without making any sound at all. That night, she cooked the remains of the rabbit she had found on the second day, dead from a hawk strike, the neck broken cleanly. She slept beside the fire and woke every hour to feed it. When she woke before dawn, the coals were still warm under their gray ash. And the first thing she did, before water, before anything else, was draw the Bible from inside her coat. The 4 pages were there. Gustav Brenner's Caliphate in her own careful hand, the charcoal lines thin and precise in the pre-dawn dark. She traced the serpentine channels with her fingertip. She moved her lips over the numbers without sound. 2 feet wide, 18 inches tall, 15 feet of vertical rise. The stone drinks the heat. The stone holds the heat. The stone gives the heat back. She closed the Bible. She wrapped it in the gray blanket. She stood up in the Wyoming dark and looked at the country around her and began, for the first time since the wagon had pulled away 3 days before, to plan rather than simply survive. For the next 6 days she walked. She walked the valley from its narrowest point to its widest, mapping the terrain the way a surveyor maps it, not for beauty but for use. She climbed the lower slopes of the western ridge and noted the standing dead timber, the game trails, the springs that ran too cold to freeze entirely even in hard winters. She marked in her mind every patch of ground that lay too low, every place where spring meltwater would pool and saturate. She was looking for something specific, and she knew what it looked like before she found it. The way you sometimes know the shape of what you need before you have words for it. She found it on the afternoon of November 20th. She pushed through a screen of young fir on the western slope and stopped. Before her was a natural alcove cut into the hillside, 12 feet deep, 15 feet wide, floored with packed earth, open to the south, sheltered on 3 sides by the earth itself. The hillside, above and behind it, was solid, the kind of deep-rooted geological permanence that had nothing to do with season or weather. The southern exposure meant winter sun would pour through the opening for most of every clear day. Something about the geometry of the slope told her there was stone underneath it, granite rather than shale, the kind of foundation that did not shift or settle. She stepped inside. She turned in a slow circle. She was beginning to understand what it would take to close off that open face, log, stone, clay, patience. She was calculating the angle of the roofline when her boot connected with something that made a dry sound against the packed earth floor. Not the sound of a stone. She looked down. A man's boot. Old leather, the heel worn nearly through, the lace long since rotted to fiber. It lay on its side under a drift of wind-blown pine needles and decomposing fur duck. She crouched. She swept the debris aside with her palm. Beside the boot lay a piece of plank board, perhaps 6 inches wide and 10 inches long, its wood weathered to the pale gray of old bone, broken at one end and clean at the other. Letters had been cut into the clean end with a knife point, pressed deep into the grain by someone who had taken time with it. She held the board up to the thin afternoon light filtering through the firs above the alcove. Built wrong, died warm enough to know it. She read it 3 times. She did not move for a long while. The wind moved through the tops of the firs with a low, continuous sound like breath through a hollow reed. Someone had stood in this exact alcove before her. Someone had read the same hillside, the same southern exposure, the same geometry, and had understood that this was the right place. Someone had built here and had failed and had lived just long enough in the warmth of whatever fire he had managed to sustain to understand the nature of the failure. He had used the last warmth in his fingers to cut a message into a piece of wood for whoever came next. Then the cold had finished its work, and the seasons had erased him except for a boot and 10 words. Adeline sat down on the packed earth of the alcove floor with the board in her lap. She thought about the man who had carved it. He had been right about everything that mattered before the technical knowledge. Right about the hillside, right about the exposure, right about the geometry. What he had not been given, what no one in this vast country had thought to give him, was the knowledge of how stone could be made to hold what fire produced. He had built a fire and let the heat go straight into the sky, which is what every conventional fireplace in every settler cabin on the Wyoming plains did, because no one here had yet been given reason to believe there was any other way to do it. She reached inside her coat. She drew out the Bible. She held it in both hands. She felt the weight of the 4 pages at the back, not heavy, not substantial in any physical sense, and yet carrying a weight that was real in some other dimension of measure. I have what you didn't, she said to the man who had carved the board wherever he was now. She said it without sound. She said it the way her mother had sometimes addressed the rain barrel or the frozen ground, or any other difficult and indifferent thing that needed to understand the terms being set for it. I'm sorry no one gave it to you, but I have it. I'm going to build it. I'm going to live. She put the Bible back inside her coat. She carried the boot and the board out of the alcove to where a young juniper grew at the entrance. She scraped a shallow grave in the half-frozen earth with the edge of a flat stone. She laid the boot in the grave. She laid the board on top of it, face down, so the carved words rested against the leather like a hand on a shoulder. She covered them with earth and pine needles and placed a single flat stone on top of the small mound, the way she had once seen her mother place a stone over a neighbor's stillborn child in Nebraska, a gesture that expected nothing back but fused nothing at all. She stood. She walked back into the alcove. She stood at its center and turned in a slow circle. She looked at the back wall and the side walls and the open south face and the angle of the fading afternoon light. She began in her head to dig. The temperature that night dropped to 12 degrees above zero. She built her fire at the mouth of the alcove and fed it with armloads of standing dead pines she had dragged from the slope above. And she dreamed of stone, long serpentine channels curling through a wall the color of old bone, a fire so small she could cup it in her hands, a warmth so patient it lasted from one dawn to the next without asking anything further of the person it protected. She woke before sunrise. She pried a flat so stone the creek bed and sharpened it to its edge against a harder piece of granite. She returned to the alcove. She knelt at the line she had scratched into the earth the evening before. She drove the sharpened stone down into the cold dirt. She pried up the first clod. She set it aside. She drove the stone down again. It was November 26, 1881. She had approximately 3 weeks before the real snow came down from the big horns. She had a body already lean from a week of near starvation that would grow leaner before it grew stronger. She had a single gray blanket and a piece of curved bottle glass and a fire she would have to keep alive through every cloudy day by other means she had not yet worked out. She had no tools beyond what she could sharpen from what the hillside offered. She had no help, no neighbors whose names she knew, no name of her own that anyone in this valley had thought to learn. She had a Bible with 4 pages of charcoal diagrams in the back. She had the memory of an old master mason that no one else on the wagon train had thought worth keeping. She had a flat stone sharpened against harder rock and a foundation line scratched in frozen earth, grave she had dug at the mouth of the alcove for a man whose name she did not know, whose 10 carved words she intended to answer with something that would still be standing when the answer no longer required her presence to remain true. She drove the stone down again. The cold dirt gave way. She drove it down and again and again, and the foundation trenched deepened one clawful at a time into Wyoming earth, while above her on the high ridges the first real snow clouds of the long winter gathered over the big horns and considered when to come down. 7 days into the foundation work had begun. December 3rd, she heard the mule. She did not look up. She had learned in the days alone that sounds in this country traveled distant distance that made immediate response foolish, a creak of leather, a hoof on stone. These could mean something 50 yards distant or something 500 yards distant, and jerking her head up at every sound would only keep her from the work. She fitted the sandstone slab she was holding. She tapped it flat with her palm. She troweled creek clay into the joint with a bark slicer. Only when the hoofbeats had come close enough that she could hear the particular creak of a saddle under the weight of a rider did she turn her head. A man on a mule had come up the creek trail and was sitting 30 yards out watching her. He was somewhere past 60, not old in the way of men who had grown soft with comfort, but old in the way of an axe handle that has been used hard for decades without breaking, the grain compressed and darkened and unlikely to fail under any load that had not already failed it. His coat was oiled canvas the color of dirty straw. His beard was iron gray and trimmed close against his jaw. His hat had once been black. He sat the mule the way men sit horses who have been doing it since before they could remember, balanced without thinking about it, easy in a way that had nothing to do with relaxation. He sat and watched her for a full minute without speaking. Adeline wiped clay from her hands on her skirt and waited. He swung down from the mule with the stiffness of a man past 60 in cold weather, tied the animal to the young juniper at the alcove entrance without looking at the knot, and walked to the foundation trench. He crouched. He put one bare hand against the top course of fitted sandstone and moved it slowly along the joint between two stones, reading the tightness of the fit, the pressure of the clay between. He stood. He looked at the alcove, at the sledge of green willow branches she had lashed together to drag stone from the creek bed, at the fire she had kept burning for 11 days now under a rock overhang at the side of the alcove, at the gray blanket folded on a flat stone with the worn Bible tucked carefully inside it. Then he looked at her. "You're the girl the wagon left." His voice was lower than his size suggested, and there was something in the vowels, some compression of sound that had been shaped by another language before English had its turn with it. "Yes, sir." He nodded once, the nod of a man confirming something he had been told and found to be accurate. He looked again at the foundation. He looked again at her hands, the cracked knuckles, the calluses yellow and hard as hoof wall, the nails torn to the quick. His eyes did not linger on her face, which she understood even at 16 to be a particular kind of courtesy from a man of his generation toward a young woman alone. "Ezra Holcomb," he said. "I have a place 7 miles north on this creek. Been there 4 years. I heard about you 3 days ago from a rancher passing my fence line. Said there was a girl building a stone wall in the alcove above the cottonwoods. I didn't believe him until this morning. Adeline Vance. I'm pleased to meet you, Mr. Holcomb." Something moved at the corner of his mouth that did not quite become a smile, but carried the same information. He was, she thought, a man who had ridden out expecting to find a grave and was instead being introduced to a person. "You plan to winter here," he said. "Not a question." "Yes, sir, with what you have." "With what I have." He looked at the sky. The pale December sky told him something that did not improve his expression. "2 weeks," he said. "Maybe 2.5 before the hefeful snow comes off the big horns. A man can't work outside more than an hour at a stretch after that without losing function in his fingers. You understand this?" "Yes, sir. You think you can put up a wall and a roof and a chimney in 2 weeks?" "Yes, sir." "With what tools?" She lifted her hands. He looked at them for a long time. Whatever he saw there arranged itself into something he was still working out when he said quietly, "Where did you learn to set stone like that?" She had not realized until he asked it how carefully she had been carrying the answer to that question, the way a person carries a small valuable object in a pocket, aware of its presence at every step without consciously accounting for it. "From a man in our wagon train," she said. "A mason. He was always explaining something he called a masonry heater, a catchalofen. He said it could heat a room for 18 hours from a single 2-hour fire. He drew the designs every night by the fire and explained everything. The men on the train thought he was an eccentric old foreigner with strange ideas." She paused. "I didn't think that." Ezra Holcomb went very still. The stillness was complete and sudden, the way a deer goes still in the instant, before it identifies what it is looking at. He did not breathe in any visible way. The wind moved through the firs. A pine cone drew somewhere above them on the slope and clicked twice against stone before stopping. "What was his name?" he said. The flatness in his voice was not coldness. It was the voice of a man bracing against something he could not stop from arriving. "Gustav Brenner." Ezra Holcomb closed his eyes. He kept them closed the way a man closes his eyes when a piece of news he has been dreading finally confirms itself. When he opened them again, the iron in his gaze was steady, but the corners were wet in a way that had nothing to do with wind, because there was no wind inside the alcove just then. Gustav Brenner, he said very quietly, was a man I knew. Adeline did not speak. She understood without being told that the next words here were not hers to choose. Ezra walked to a flat stone on the edge of the alcove and sat down on it with both his hands on his knees, the posture of a man spending the last of something. He looked at the foundation trench rather than at her. He came west 2 years before you, he said. We'd known each other before, been neighbors in Indiana before I came out here. He was the finest mason I ever saw work. When his wife passed back east, he said he wanted to go somewhere a man's skills could matter. He thought the homesteaders out here would want to know how to heat their cabins without burning through a cord of wood every week just to stay alive. He drew a long breath that was not quite steady. They didn't want to know. He spent a year going from claim to claim in this territory trying to give his knowledge away, and not one man took it seriously. He stayed a week with me. We drank coffee. He showed me his drawings. He said he'd decided to build one himself, a small heater in his own cabin, just to prove the thing could be done with this stone and this clay. Once men could see it, he said, they'd believe. Ezra's hands pressed harder against his knees. He went home to his claim on the Crazy Woman Creek Fork, 11 miles west. I rode out to him in February when I hadn't heard anything in too long. Found him on the floor beside a heater he had almost finished. There were stones still stacked next to it, clay in a bucket that had frozen and split the bucket. He had a chisel in his hand, his heart, I think. Another week of work, maybe 10 days, and the thing would have been complete. He never lit it even once. The alcove was very quiet. I buried him on his claim, Ezra said. I marked the grave with a stone. I rode back to my place and I told my wife about it, and she cried. I didn't cry. But I have thought about Gustav Brenner nearly day since. I thought he died with everything inside him, every drawing, every number, every year of knowing something this country refused to learn. He looked up from the foundation trench, and his eyes found her face and held it. You were listening. Yes, sir. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. Every night by the fire, he never knew I was paying attention. I don't think he knew anyone was. No, Ezra said. He wouldn't have. He was that kind of man. He talked to the air and trusted the air to remember. He stood. He moved with the care of old joints in cold weather, hands on knees measured. He walked to the edge of the foundation trench and looked at it one more time, at the careful courses of fitted sandstone running across the alcove's open face, at the tight clay joints, at the work that represented 11 days of a girl's hands against frozen ground. He was not looking at the foundation anymore. She could see it in his face. He was looking at something 11 miles west on a creek fork, at an unfinished heater, and a man who had died still holding his tools. And he was understanding for the first time that the work had not ended with the man who began it. I have a broken axe head at my place, Ezra said. His voice had roughened, but it held. Handle broke last spring. I never got around to replacing it. You could carve a new one from green ash. I've got a piece in my barn. Broken saw blade too, about 12 inches of good steel left. You can cut a great deal with 12 inches of good steel if you're careful about it. And I have some salt pork I could spare. A few pounds. He stopped. My wife would have wanted you to have it. We lost her 3 years back. We did well this season. Mr. Holcomb, you'll pay me back in the spring. He said it with the finality of a man closing a door on a road he has no intention of traveling. Not in any other way. Not in thanks. I'm not doing this for you. He looked at her steadily. I'm doing it for him. Yes, sir. He looked at her once more. The way a man looks at a younger person who has been handed a weight he knows the measure of, and she does not yet, and his expression carrying the particular complexity of someone who has buried more friends than he ever planned to bury and finds himself against his own judgment, making room for one more thing in his chest etch that might require mourning later. Don't die, Adeline Vance, he said. I have enough grief on this creek without adding yours. He walked to his mule. He untied it from the juniper. She noticed then that the knot was a particular kind she had not seen before. Something a man ties when he has tied 10,000 knots and no longer has to think about whether they'll hold. He swung up. He rode south down the creek trail without looking back, and the dust from the mule's hooves rose in the cold air and settled. Adeline stood at the edge of her foundation trench with both hands pressed flat against the front of her coat, over the place where the Bible sat against her rib. She stood for a long time without moving, and the wind moved through the firs above the alcove. And somewhere on the slope, a stone dislodged out itself and rolled a short distance and stopped. And the smoke from her carefully maintained fire rose straight in the cold, still air of the late afternoon. She was not building only a shelter anymore. She understood that now with a completeness that had not been available to her an hour before. She was building an answer to a question a dead man had asked with his last chisel stroke. She was building proof that the air had remembered what it was trusted to keep. She was building the thing that Gost spent Brenner his last year trying to give to a country that had not yet learned to want it. And she was going to build it with sharpened Nelson Creek stone and clay, and the 4 pages of a dead man's knowledge now that her father had thrown into the wilderness without knowing what he was throwing. She drove the foundation stone down again into the Wyoming earth. The cold had come in earnest now, the kind that arrived in the Big Horn country in early December with the manner of something that intended to stay. Above her on the high ridges, the snow clouds that had been gathering for days were making their decision. Below her in the alcove floor, the foundation trench deepened by 1 careful inch. She worked until she could no longer see what she was doing. Then she built the fire up and sat with her back against the warm earth of the alcove wall and opened the Bible to the 4 pages in the back and traced the lines with her finger in the firelight, the way a musician traces a score before performing it, not learning it. She had already learned it, but renewing the connection between the knowledge in her head and the knowledge in her hands, making sure the two were still the same. The fire burned down. She fed it. The Wyoming dark pressed against the open face of the alcove. The temperature was dropping through the floor of what most people would call cold into the territory below that, where the air itself seemed to thin, and the stars overhead looked closer and harder than stars had any right to look. She pulled the gray blanket around her shoulder. She closed the Bible. She pressed her back against the earth and felt the faint stored warmth of its soil awed against her spine. Thermal mass, she thought. The earth acting as the stone acted in Brenner's drawings, giving back what the sun had deposited over the long hours of the day. There was something in that. He was worth in understanding in the fact that the principle was everywhere once you knew how to see it. That the earth had been doing this the whole time. That the knowledge was not foreign or strange or the eccentric obsession of a lonely old man. It was simply a description of what the physical world already did, written in a language that someone had finally thought to teach her. She would learn the rest of the language. She would build the device that made the principle intentional rather than accidental. She would survive this winter on this hillside in this alcove, and she would do it with 4 pages of charcoal lines pressed against her ribs in a dead woman's coat. The fire said what fires say, which is nothing, which is everything. She let it say it. Ezra Holcomb came back the next morning before the light had fully committed to the sky, his mule moving quiet on the frozen creek trail, the breath from both of them rising in white columns that the cold air took and unmade within seconds. He set down what he had brought at the edge of the alcove without ceremony, the broken axe head, dark iron, the socket end where the handle had sheared clean. The saw blade, 12 inches of good steel with teeth still sharp along the surviving edge. A cloth sack of salt pork, 3 pounds by the feel of it. A folded note in a woman's careful hand that read only, "God keep you, child." He did not explain the note. He set everything down, looked once at the foundation with the expression of a man confirming a structural calculation, nodded, and rode away. She had the axe head fitted to a green ash handle slide carved with the broken saw blade and 2 days of her teeth before sunset. The fitting was imperfect. She had to wedge the socket with a sliver of hardwood to prevent the head from turning on the swing. But imperfect and functional occupied the same category in her current economy. By nightfall, she could fell a tree. The sound the axe made against lodgepole pine in the December cold was the cleanest sound she had heard since the wagon disappeared, a sound with no ambiguity in it, the pure binary of wood giving way or not giving way. And she found she preferred it to almost everything she could remember about the sounds people made. The double frame wall was her own reasoning, worked out in the cut bank during her shaking nights of the first week when she had nothing to do but think and count. Brenner's drawings showed her how to build the heater. They did not show her how to build the structure around it, because Brenner had been a man who assumed a structure already existed and needed only to receive the heater inside it. Adeline had no structure. What she had was principle: thermal mass retains heat. Mass must be protected from moisture and wind to function. And from that principle, she reasoned outward to a wall that was not one wall but two. An inner ring of straight lodgepole logs 6 inches through, carrying the roof load, an outer ring set 4 feet beyond it, the cavity between packed solid with fitted sandstone, creek clay, and compressed earth. The inner frame would carry the roof. The outer frame would shield everything inside. The 4 feet of stone and clay mass between them would do the work that Brenner's drawings described, absorbing the heat the heater produced, holding it, giving it back across the hours when the fire had been banked and the Wyoming dark had settled in with its full weight. No one taught her this. She reasoned it from cold and necessity and 4 pages of another man's knowledge, the way water reasons its way through stone. Not by intelligence exactly, but by persistence applied to the path of least resistance, finding the route that the physics of the situation had always contained. By December 8th, she had the outer frame stand. The inner frame followed 2 days later, the lodgepole logs notched at the corners with the broken saw blade and seated into the foundation course with clay packed tight around the base. The cavity between the frames gaped open to the December sky, and she began immediately to fill it. Sandstone slabs dragged on the willow sledge from the outcrop a quarter-mile downstream, fitted by hand into the cavity and courses that she leveled by eye because she had no other instrument, tamping creek clay into the joints with the flat of her palm. On December 11th, she heard a different horse on the creek trail. Not the mule's patient forebeat, but something longer strided, more deliberate, the gait of an animal accustomed to covering ground efficiently. She did not stop working. She fitted the stone she was holding, pressed clay into the joint, stepped back to read the course with her eye. Only when the horse had stopped and the leather had creaked with a dismounting did she turn. The man who came across the yard to her work site walked the way men walk who have spent years being the person in any gathering who knew the most about the physical world, not arrogantly, exactly, but with a confidence so deeply habituated it had stopped requiring conscious maintenance. He was in his early 40s, clean-shaven, his dark coat brushed that morning, his boots showing the residue of trail mud that he had not gotten around to removing, but would have removed if time had permitted. He stopped at the edge of the foundation and read it the way she had seen Ezra read it, with his hands first, crouching to run his fingers along the joints, then with his eyes moving outward to the frame structure and the chimney footing she had begun in the back corner of the alcove. He stood up. He looked at her. "My name is Colonel Silas Wentworth," he said, his voice carrying the particular compression of someone accustomed to being heard over wind and distance. "I'm engineering officer for the Burlington Survey, operating out of a camp 14 miles south. I heard about this site from one of my men who passed through last week." He looked at the chimney footing, the great square base of fitted stone that would eventually carry the full mass of the heater, 4 feet wide and 6 feet deep and climbing, in her plan, to 12 feet of height. The corner of his mouth moved downward. "Young lady, may I speak frankly?" "Yes, sir." "There are 4 things wrong with what you're doing here." He held up one gloved finger. "First, that chimney, when you build it to the height I believe you intend, will weigh somewhere between 8 and 10 tons of fitted stone. Your foundation does not appear to me to be adequate for that load. It will settle in the spring thaw. It will crack. In all probability, it will collapse." A second finger. "Sandstone cannot take sustained firebox heat. It cracks, it spalls, it fails within a season. A proper firebox requires firebrick. You have no firebrick, which means you have, in essence, no firebox." Third finger. "Even if your foundation holds and your firebox holds, you have no way to calculate whether your serpentine flue will draw. Draft is not intuition, it is mathematics. The cross-section of the firebox opening against the cross-section of the chimney exit, the vertical rise, the number and angle of the bends. A flue that fails to draw either smokes you out of your own structure or, with the door sealed against cold, suffocates you in your sleep." The fourth finger. "You are building into a hillside in Wyoming. When the snowpack on this slope begins releasing in April, the water coming through the alcove will be significant. Your walls will saturate, your mortar will fail, and depending on the soil composition above you, the hillside may give way entirely." He lowered his hand. He looked at her with the settled patience of a man who has delivered this kind of assessment many times before and always found it necessary. I'm not telling you this to discourage you. I'm telling you because you have shown considerable resourcefulness. And I would prefer not to ride past this site in April and find a girl frozen under a pile of collapsed stone. Come to my camp. We have a spare tent with a good stove. You can stay until spring, and we'll see about getting you to Clearwater Crossing or back to your family. He waited. Adeline had been holding a fitted stone in her right hand during the entire speech, a clean rectangle of sandstone she had broken that morning, perhaps 4 pounds, edges true. She held it without appearing to notice it. Mr. Wentworth, she said, you're right about the 8 to 10 tons. I estimated 9. The foundation under the chimney mass goes down 3 feet to the granite shelf. She tapped the sole of her boot on the alcove floor. That shelf extends under this entire alcove and into the hillside behind it. I dug 3 test pits along the back wall to confirm the depth. It's one continuous piece of bedrock. The chimney mass doesn't need my foundation to hold it. The mountain does. He did not speak. You're right about the sandstone in the firebox, she continued. It will crack. I expect it to crack. I plan to use it this winter because this winter is what I have. And sandstone cracks is warmer than no firebox at all. When spring allows travel, I'll go to Clearwater Crossing and find fire brick, or find clay suitable for firing into something close to it. One winter on sandstone is the cost of being alive in April to replace it. His expression had changed. Something in it was recalculating. You're right that draft is mathematics. She set the sandstone slab down on the top course of the foundation wall. She drew the Bible from inside her coat and opened it to the back pages, held it out toward him. The firebox opening is 2 feet wide and 18 inches tall, 3 square feet. Chimney exit is 1 square foot. Vertical rise from firebox top to stack cap is 15 feet. The serpentine flue has 3 bends. The bends are wide, tight bends create turbulence that defeats the draft. For every horizontal foot of flue travel, the resistance requires 1 additional inch of stack height to compensate for friction loss. I have 15 feet of horizontal travel through the channels. I've added 15 inches to the stack above what a straight flue would require. It will draw. Wentworth took the Bible from her with both hands. He looked at the 4 pages. He took his time with them. He read the way a man reads technical drawings he has not seen before, but recognizes immediately as the product of genuine knowledge. Not quickly, not with the skimming attention of someone looking for errors, but with the focused deceleration of a person who has encountered something that requires the full measure of what he knows to evaluate. He gave the Bible back to her gently, using both hands. The meltwater, he said, French drain, 3 feet deep, lined with creek gravel, running around the back of the alcove and out to the lower ground east of the entrance. I dug it the week I found this site, before I started any construction. When the snowpack releases, the water will route around the structure, not through it. Wentworth's mouth had come open by perhaps a 1/4 inch. You'll need help raising the roof timbers, he said. His voice had changed in some way that was difficult to name. It carried the same authority, but the authority was no longer positioned above her. It was level. I'll come back in 3 days with 2 of my men. We'll get the roof up in 1 afternoon. He picked up his hat from where he had set it on a stone and turned it in his hands. Miss Vance, I came up that creek with a finished speech. I want you to know that I understand I'm leaving without it. You confirmed every figure I had, sir. That's the most useful kind of instruction there is. Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile, but was its first cousin. He put his hat on. He swung up onto the bay horse. He rode south on the creek trail, and she watched him go, and then she went back to packing stone into the wall cavity, because the December sky had the look of a sky that was making up its mind, and she needed the cavity filled before it decided. The roof went up on December 14th. Wentworth returned with 2 hired men, both of them large, experienced, and quietly surprised by what they found when they arrived. They raised straight lodgepole logs across the double wall frames in one long, cold afternoon, Adeline carrying weight alongside them and talking less than either of the hired men did. Over the logs they laid bark. Over the bark, 8 inches of packed earth sloped to shed water toward the front, a gap at the corner framed and braced where the chimney stack would rise. By the time the light failed, the alcove had for the first time the shape of a structure that intended to be permanent. Wentworth looked at it in the last gray light. He touched the brim of his hat to her and rode south without additional ceremony. She was coming to understand was his version of the highest compliment he knew how to pay. She built the cachilofan over the next day and a half in a state of concentration so complete it displaced everything else: hunger, cold, the awareness of her own body. The question of what had happened to her sisters on the wagon that was still moving somewhere east of her without its oldest daughter. She built the firebox first, set into the back corner at floor level, 2 feet wide and 18 inches tall, lined with the flattest and densest sandstone she had been able to find and sort over the previous weeks. From the back of the firebox, she ran the first horizontal flue along the back wall behind the chimney mass. At the corner, she turned it. The second leg ran along the side wall. At the second corner, she turned it again and ran the third leg back toward the front, where it opened into the vertical stack that would climb through the roof and into the Wyoming sky. 15 feet of horizontal travel, 3 wide bends, every joint mortared with creek clay mixed with coarse sand and dry grass fiber. She worked by feel as much as by cease, and in the dim interior, reading the stone the way Brenner had described reading it, finding the natural face, the side that wanted to lie down, the side that wanted to stand up, and placing each piece according to what the stone itself indicated rather than forcing it into a geometry it hadn't chosen. On December 15th, with snow beginning outside and the temperature falling past 12 degrees above zero, she lit the first fire. The smoke rolled back out of the firebox mouth into the cabin. Her eyes burned. She let the fire die. And she climbed through the hatch she had left in the roof and sat in the blowing snow on the cold boards, with her legs around the chimney stack, and understood with complete clarity what had happened. The friction loss through 3 wide bends in cold clay that had not yet cured properly was greater than her calculation had accounted for. The stack was 18 inches too short. She climbed down. She gathered 18 inches of fitted stone from the pile outside. She climbed back up in the snow in the failing light and laid course after course on the stack's cap, the clay stiff with cold, warming each trowel between her palms before pressing it into the joint. Her hands went numb past sensation. She worked by pressure rather than feeling, trusting the geometry because she could no longer trust her fingers to report accurately on what they touched. She climbed down. She built the second fire. The smoke entered the first horizontal channel. She pressed her palm flat against the stone wall, 6 inches above the channel, and felt it, the heat moving with the smoke through the stone, depositing itself into the mass the way Brenner described it. Depositing itself the way water deposits minerals as it moves through limestone, slowly, incrementally, building something that outlasts the movement itself. The smoke turned at the first corner. It ran along the side wall. It turned at the second corner. It climbed through the vertical stack. From the cap of the stack 10 feet above the roof, the smoke rose into the falling snow in a clean, straight column, the color of old wool, unwavering. She stood inside her cabin with her palm flat on the chimney mass and felt the heat radiating outward into the stone from the channels running through it. She listened. The sound the heater made was exactly what Brenner had described on those evenings by the wagon train fire, a low, sustained note like wind moving through a hollow tree, the voice of combustion that had found its proper path and would not be redirected. She did not celebrate. She sat down on the packed earth floor with her against the warming stone, pulled the gray blanket around her shoulders, and watched the small red glow of the closed firebox damper. She stayed there for a long time without moving. At some point in that stillness, without knowing exactly when, she began to laugh, not the laugh of happiness, but something more like the laugh of a person who has been carrying an argument with the physical world for 7 weeks and has finally heard the world concede the point. The stone was warm against her spine. Outside, the temperature was dropping past zero and still going. The snow that fell that night laid 6 inches across the alcove entrance. She woke at 2 in the morning and pressed her palm to the chimney mass. It was still warm. The cabin held at 38 degrees without a single additional stick of fuel. She had used in one firing what a conventional fireplace burned in 2 hours just to hold the cold at bay for a single night. She fell back asleep with her hands still on the stone. January came in with the particular cruelty of the Wyoming high country, not a single sustained cold, but a cold that varied between severe and catastrophic, with clear days of deceptive brilliance between storms that arrived from the north with the directness of something that had decided. Preston Daly appeared on January 6th, a surveyor for the Burlington line, Riding a rangy sorrel, he pushed harder than the horse preferred. He had heard about the cabin from Wentworth's camp and had come out of what he called professional curiosity, which Adeline recognized as the phrase men used when they did not want to admit they had come out of astonishment. He walked the structure. He studied the cachalothan's exterior with the focused attention of a man whose work required him to understand how things held together in country that tried to pull them apart. He examined the wind cap she had not yet built. "You need a collar around the top of that stack," he told her, his voice carrying the flat practicality of someone who has spent years telling people what they need without much concern for whether they want to hear it. Open stack in a real blizzard backdrafts. Wind comes straight down the pipe and fills the cabin with smoke before you can get the damper shut. Stone collar around the top, openings and four sides, flat capstone on top of the collar. Wind hits the collar instead of the pipe opening, creates a low pressure zone that actually improves the draft. He looked at her. "I'll stay 2 days and help you build it." He stayed 2 days. They worked together in the cold, they daily directing the geometry and Adeline doing the climb. And when the collar was finished, she stood on the roof and looked at it and understood that it was correct in the way that things are correct when the physics of the situation is properly read. She filed the knowledge beside the friction loss correction and the French drain and the double wall cavity in the part of her mind where the operational knowledge of this particular winter was accumulating. "I told the camp manager you were here," Daly said on the morning he left. He was tightening the sorrel's cinch, his breath making brief white shapes in the January air. "They'll be running a work crew through this valley come September. 35 men, camp 14 miles south, 3 months of work. They need a cook, $22 a month." He looked at her over the horse's back. "I told him, and anyone who survived what you survived and built what you built can feed 35 men without losing her composure. He's willing to take my word for it. $22 a month for 3 months, $66 in coin." She did the arithmetic before he finished the sentence. Firebrick from crossing, a proper axe, a saw with a full blade, seed for a kitchen garden, a milk cow if the prices were what she thought they were. The difference between a winter she survived and a life she could build. "I'll do it," she said. Daly nodded and mounted and rode south. And Adeline went back inside and banked the cachalothan for the day and thought about September the way you think about a distant landfall when you are still in deep water, real, possible, worth keeping in the direction of your rowing. The blizzard came on January 31st. It announced itself the morning before with a shift in the air pressure that she felt in her ears before she heard the change in the wind, a tightening of the atmosphere that the old hands on the oil wagon train had recognized as the sign of a serious storm coming down from the north with nothing to slow it between the Canadian line and the Big Horns but open grassland. She fired the cachalothan for 4 solid hours, burning dry lodgepole fast and hot until the chimney mass radiated heat she could feel from 6 feet distant. She closed the firebox damper. She banked the cabin door with packed snow from the inside, the way Ezra had told her to do if she was ever caught in a real one. She filled every container she had with snow for meltwater and set them near the chimney base. Then she sat down and waited for the storm to arrive. It arrived at dusk. The wind hit the cabin walls with a sound she had not heard before, not the sustained pressure of ordinary winter wind, but something rhythmic and massive, waves of force that made the roof timbers speak in a language of stress she found herself unconsciously translating. She pressed her back against the cachalothan and felt the stone radiating its stored warmth into the cabin and did not move. The temperature outside, she would learn later from Wentworth's camp thermometer, had dropped past 30 degrees below zero within the first 6 hours and had continued falling. She heard the pounding on the second night, 2 in the morning by her best estimate, the storm in its 32nd hour. A sound coming from the east-northeast, through 2 feet of blowing snow and 30 degrees of negative temperature, small, rhythmic, the sound of something human being made against wood by a human hand. She pressed her ear against the cabin door. The sound came again, weaker, the Calloway family. Their claim was 280 yards east-northeast of the alcove. She had never visited them. She had seen the smoke from their stovepipe on clear days and had registered their presence in the valley the way you register presence of other fragile creatures in show archery, as a fact that might someday become relevant. It had become relevant. She had 80 feet of braided rawhide rope, assembled over weeks from strips of green hide Ezra had given her in November. She tied one end to the central structural post of the cabin. She wrapped a wool scarf, her mother's, the one thing in the coat pocket besides the Bible, around her face until only her eyes were exposed. She tied the rope's other end around her waist. She opened the door. The cold entered the cabin the way something enters that has been waiting for the door to open. She bent into the wind and stepped out into the dark. She could see nothing beyond the rope in her hand. The snow was more chest high in the drifts against the alcove face, thigh deep in the more sheltered ground between the firs, and the wind drove it horizontally with enough force that it stung through the wool over her face as though the wool were not there. She pushed forward and counted her steps the way she had counted in the cut bank in November, deliberately, allowed inside the scarf, each number a small flag planted in the white chaos of the storm. At 80 feet, the rope ran out. She stood at the end of her tether in the dark and the howling and cupped her mittened hands around her face and shouted the Callaway name into the storm with everything she had. She shouted until her voice became something she no longer recognized as her own voice, thin, raw, while swallowed by the wind before it had traveled 3 feet. She stopped. She listened. The pounding, when she strained to hear it, was gone. She did not know if it had stopped because someone had heard her, or because the wind had shifted between them, or because the person who had been making it no longer had the strength. She did the calculation in the dark at the end of her rope. 80 feet used, 200 yards between her and the Callaway cabin. No second rope, no anchor point and for new one. No way to find her own door again in a 30-below blizzard if she released the line she was holding. 2 lives measurable, her own, certain if she turned back. The Callaway lives, almost certainly already resolved by the time she stood here calculating. She turned back, hand over hand along the rope in the dark, through the drifts, through the wind, through the blowing that had no because it had every direction simultaneously. She found her door by the feel of the frame against her mittens. She stepped through. She closed the door. She barred it. She slid down the back of the door to the floor and sat with the rope still in her hands and her back blind against the wood and the couchal of its warmth reaching toward her across 15 feet of dark cabin interior. She did not move until morning. The storm broke on February 3rd. The silence that followed a Wyoming blizzard was a specific kind of silence. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of a stillness so complete it had a texture, like cloth. Ezra Holcomb rode his mule along the creek trail in the white morning light, checking every claim within 10 miles. He came to the Callaway place. He was inside for a long time. When he came out, he stood in the brilliant cold sun with his hat in his hands, and then he put his hat back on and rode to the alcove. He knocked. She opened the door and saw his face and knew before he spoke. "All 4, he said quietly. "Father, mother, 2 boys. The father had an axe. There were marks on the inside wall by the door." He stopped. He looked at the smoke rising from her stack in the cold, still air, straight, clean, unhurried. Conventional stove. They burned through 2 weeks of fuel in 3 days trying to keep above freezing. The wood ran out, I think, the morning of the 2nd day of the storm. She did not speak. 280 yards, Ezra said. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the chimney stack. "That is all there was between what they had and what you've built here." He rode home to tell his wife's sister, who was staying with him through the winter. Adeline closed the cabin door. She stood in the warm interior with her back against the wood for the 2nd time in 3 days, and she let the weight of the Callaway family settle onto her the way snow settles onto a roof. Not all at once, but in layers. Each one lighter than it seems until you look up and realize the cumulative load has become something you will carry from now on rather than something you will put down. She did not make a sound. She sat beside the catchalofen and felt its warmth and understood with the slow, irrevocable clarity that had been her companion through this entire winter through that the price for surviving was not paid once. It was an ongoing account. The Callaway family had spent everything they had trying to solve a problem that she had solved. The distance between their solution and hers was 15 feet of stone and one old man's knowledge that the world had refused to receive. She would spend the rest of her life finding ways to close that distance. February arrived with the cold that the Plains country held back during January storms and released in the quiet weeks between them, a dry structural cold that did not blow but simply existed at temperatures that made metal brittle and breath visible from 30 feet away. Her food ran out on the 12th. She had been rationing for 3 weeks, dropping to one meal a day of cornmeal and whatever the snare line produced. But the snares had been empty for 9 days. The rabbits had gone deep into the brush where the cold pushed them and where her snares did not reach. On the morning of the 12th, she rose to collect firewood and found that her legs had opinions about the matter that differed from her intention. She sat down on the cabin floor in the cold with her back against the calaphon and understood with the same flat arithmetic she had applied to every other problem this winter that she had built a perfect engine and had neglected to maintain the fuel supply for the mechanism that operated it. Wentworth arrived 4 days later on the bay horse. He had pushed hard from his camp through the February cold because he had not received word from the alcove in 3 weeks. And men who had not received word from the alcove in 3 weeks had begun, in the circles around his camp stove, to speak of it in the past tense. He opened the door without waiting for an answer to his knock and found her on the floor with her back against the chimney mass and her hands in her lap and her eyes on the closed firebox damper. He set down what he had been carrying. The smell reached her before she raised her head, frozen meat, clean and cold, and the dry grain smell of beans. Her stomach turned over inside her with the slow revolution of something that had stopped moving a long time ago and has been reminded what movement feels like. "Your chimney works better than mine," he said. His voice was rougher than it had been in December, the voice of a man who had ridden a long way in a cold wind and was not done being honest with himself about what he had done with the information from the last time he'd been here. "I tore out my conventional fireplace last week, built a cachalophin from memory of your drawings. The channels are too tight and the draft is poor. But it works, Miss Vance. My wife sleeps warm through the night for the first time in 2 winters." She did not speak yet. She was listening with her whole body. "I came in December prepared to instruct you," he said. "I want you to know I haven't stopped thinking about that. I'm a West Point engineer. I've built bridges that carried artillery. The best chimney in this valley was built by a 16-year-old girl with a piece of broken glass and a Bible. I think about this a great deal." He paused. "I'll be back next week. You will not go without food on this creek while I have meat in my smokehouse." "That is not a kindness. It is a correction. Do you understand me?" "Yes, sir." "Good." He closed the door behind him. She heard the baby horse move away through the crusted snow. She sat for another moment. Then she rose and rebuilt the fire and thawed a strip of elk against the warming firebox stone and ate slowly and carefully the way her mother had taught her to eat on long, hungry days, small bites and long waits between them, letting the body receive what was being given rather than rushing the transaction. By my nightfall, she was on her feet again. March came, and the snowpack on the western slope began its long release. She stood at the cabin door on the first morning of the thaw and watched the meltwater move along the French drain, sliding around the back of the structure and out to the lower ground, not one drop of it coming through the floor she stood on. She walked the back of the cabin and pressed her palm to the inner wall. Dry. She thought of Wentworth standing in December with his 4 fingers raised, and she thought you were right about nearly everything. And she thought, not this one. Ezra came up the creek in late March with seed potatoes from his root cellar, and he showed her where the south-facing slope above the cabin would hold the heat long enough to bring a kitchen garden through. Ruth Callahan, widow, 3 children, claimed 2 miles up the creek, appeared in April having heard about the cabin from Ezra and having ridden out on a raw Tuesday with the directness of a woman who has stopped waiting for circumstances to improve on their own. Ruth put her hand on the warm chimney mast the way people put their hands on things they cannot quite believe are real. "Well," she said, in the flat, dry register of a woman who has seen enough frontier winters to have lost her taste for sentiment, "I'll be damned. Old Brenner wasn't crazy. We were all just too stubborn to listen." Adeline walked her through every element, the firebox, the serpentine channels, the friction loss calculation, the importance of wide bends, the wind collar, the French drain. Ruth listened with the close attention of a woman who had put a husband in the ground because a Wyoming winter was more serious than the fireplace in his cabin, and who had no intention of making the same category of error twice. By the time she rode home that afternoon, She had a plan in her head and a list in her hand and a date set for Adeline to come help her lay the foundation. Word traveled the way smoke travels, slowly at first, lifting into the high country air, then carried on the wind to places the original fire never reached. By the end of April, 3 other families in the valley had asked Adeline to come walk their claims. She went. She accepted no money. She took instead what those families had to offer: flour, a side of bacon, a heifer calf that she walked home along the creek trail and built a lean-to for behind the alcove cabin. The calf that would grow through the summer into the first milk cow she had ever owned. In June, she laid the foundation of a Coachella fin in Ruth Callahan's new cabin. In July, she supervised the construction of a second one for a young couple from Kansas with a child coming in October who would need a warm room to be born into. In August, she advised on a third, a smaller supplemental version for Ezra's place. And when that heater drew its first clean breath, Ezra's sister-in-law, Hannah, a small, sharp-eyed woman who had come from Indiana for the winter, held Adeline's face in both hands at the door and said quietly, "She would have loved you," meaning Ezra's wife, meaning the woman who had written "God keep you" child on a folded note 3 months before. And Ezra turned away and looked at something on the horizon that had apparently become very interesting. September arrived, and Adeline saddled the bay mare she had purchased from Wentworth at his insistence from the fair value of 3 months of his wife's mending, a transaction they had both treated with the seriousness of a legal instrument. And she rode 14 miles south before dawn to cook breakfast for 35 Burlington survey men at a camp that smelled of coffee, sawdust, and the picture of exhausted determination that large outdoor work projects produce in the men who execute. She cooked 3 times a day. She rode back to the alcove in the long blue light of autumn evenings, stabbed the mare, lit her own fire, ate her own supper in her own house. In the evenings after supper, when the survey crew gathered around the central fire and the conversation settled into the comfortable register of men who have worked hard together and earned the right to sit still, Adeline brought a sharpened stick and sat with them. She drew in the dirt: firebox, channels, thermal mass, friction loss, wind collar. Some of the men asked questions, some did not. 2 of them, by October's end, asked her to write the diagrams on paper they could carry home. She wrote them from the Bible's back pages, 4 pages each, the charcoal lines as careful as the ones she had originally made by candle stub on a moving wagon in Nebraska. Not from memory anymore, from the source. The air had remembered. Now, the air was giving it back. The article ran 6 columns into the third week of September, on a Tuesday when the light had that particular Wyoming quality of arriving sideways through the cottonwoods along the creek and turning everything it touched the color of old brass. Adeline was saddling the bay mare in the pre-dawn dark when she heard Wentworth's horse on the trail below the alcove. Not riding toward camp, but stopped, waiting, the bay standing in the cold air with the patience of a well-trained animal that has learned the difference between a pause and a rest. He was holding a folded newspaper when she came around the corner of the lean-to. "The Wyoming Tribune," he said. "Yesterday's edition. Page 6. I think you should read it before you ride down." She took it from him. She opened it on the saddle in front of her, the paper stiff in the cold, and found the 6th page by the gray light just beginning to define itself above the eastern ridge. The article ran a column and a half in tight editorial type, technical in its language, precise in its measurements. The foundations set on bedrock granite, the double wall cavity, the serpentine heater, the firebox ratios, the friction loss correction, the wind collar, the French drain. Every decision she had made in the alcove from November 26th through the end of January rendered in the flat specific language of engineering documentation. Signed at the bottom, Colonel Silas Wentworth, engineer, formerly United States Army. The final paragraph was set in the same type as the rest, without flourish or special treatment, as though the weight of what it said required no additional emphasis from the typesetter. The cabin and masonry heater described in this report were designed, calculated, and constructed by Miss Adeline Vance, age 16, during the winter of 1881. The undersigned takes no credit for the design or construction. He describes only the work of a person whose intelligence and courage may now allow a piece of long-neglected knowledge to save lives across the American West. Ms. Vance has asked that the work be attributed where possible to the man who first attempted to teach it to this country and who died in that attempt. Gustav Brenner, immigrant master mason, most lately of the Crazy Woman Creek, Wyoming Territory, deceased February 1881. She read it twice. She lowered the paper. You wrote this. I wrote it. Sent it to the editor in Cheyenne 4 weeks ago. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to raise your expectations if you chose not to print it. Wentworth was looking at the furs above the alcove rather than at her. He's also written me a letter, which I have in my saddlebag, indicating his intention to reprint the article in the Chicago Tribune, possibly the St. Louis Globe Democrat. He believes the design is of national interest. You put my name on it. Correction, Miss Vance. He looked at her then, and his eyes in the gray September morning held the particular steadiness of a man who has prepared something he means to say without apology. I rode up that creek in December with a finished speech. You corrected every point in your head in front of me with charcoal lines in the back of a Bible. I rode away a different man than I had arrived. I didn't say so at the time because I didn't know how to say it without sounding like a man making a concession rather than a man acknowledging a fact. This article is the acknowledgement. He picked up his reins. I've been a union engineer for 20 years, Miss Vance. I built bridges that carried artillery across rivers in flood. The best chimney in this territory was built by a 16-year-old girl with a piece of broken glass. I think about this. I intend to keep thinking about it. He settled in the saddle. Ride to your camp. Cook breakfast for 35 men. Live a long life. That will be answer enough. He rode south on the trail, and she sat on the mare and held the folded newspaper against her chest with both hands, and cotton quant leaves dropping one at a time in the still air above the creek, each one taking its own time about the matter, as though the fall were something worth doing deliberately. That night, alone in the cabin, with the catchalofen burning low and the Wyoming Tribune spread across her knees, in the lamplight she wept. The weeping came up from somewhere below thought, below decision, the way water comes up through rock when the pressure has been building long enough that the rock finally accepts the negotiation. She wept for Gustav Brenner in his unmarked grave on the Crazy Woman Creek fork, who had drawn his serpentine channels in the dust of wagon entering fires for 6 months and trusted that the air would remember what no one present appeared to want. She wept for the man who had carved built wrong into a piece of plank board with whatever warmth his fingers retained in their final hours, whose name she still did not know, whose boot she had buried under the juniper at the alcove entrance. She wept for the Calloway family, the father with the axe, the 2 boys, the mother, 280 yards of December, darker between them and the warmth that could have held them. She wept for Margaret Vance, the Shawnee woman from Ohio who had died of lung sickness when her oldest daughter was 9 years old, and who had left her, among other things, the knowledge that panic is the enemy and the cold is just the cold. She wept last for the 16-year-old girl who had sat in the dust of the Powder River Trail, watching a waxen shrink to nothing against the bighorns, and who had believed in those first minutes that she had been left with nothing, and who had been wrong about that in every direction that mattered. She slept against the warm stone, and in the morning she rose and rode south and cooked breakfast for 35 men and did not weep again for a long time. The man came at the end of September on a gray horse ridden past its preference. She was pinning a clean apron to her dress at the cabin door, preparing for the afternoon ride to camp, when she heard the hooves on the trail from the north and looked up. Cornelius Vance had grown older in the way of certain men whose bodies outlast whatever conviction had been operating them. His shoulder sat lower in his coat. The coat itself hung in a way it had not when his frame had been fully committed to filling it. The eyes that had once held the particular pale certainty of river ice in January had gone the color of sky before a snow that has not yet decided to fall. He drew the gray horse up 20 feet from the cabin door and did not dismount. He looked at her face for a moment and then passed her at the open cabin door at the chimney stone's collar and its thin, clean column of smoke rising into the September afternoon. He said her name. She said Mr. Vance and watched the small flinch move through the corner of his mouth and did not pursue it. He had, he told her, spoken with a lawyer in Laramie. By the law of Wyoming Territory, a daughter who had not yet reached majority was the legal responsibility of her father. The claim she held, the cabin, the improvements, the milk cow and the lean-to, all of it fell under his authority by statute. He had come to exercise that authority. She could remain on the claim as his daughter. under his direction, turning over the wages from her cooking work. She would rejoin family in the spring at the place he had taken outside Clearwater Crossing. Her sisters missed her. He presented all of this in the flat recitative of a man who has rehearsed a speech until the words have separated from whatever feeling originally produced them, and who discovers in the delivery that the separation was less complete than the rehearsal suggested. She did not answer. She became aware, without turning, of a sound behind her, the soft footfall of someone coming around the eastern side of the cabin. Ezra Holcomb stepped into the yard. He had ridden up an hour earlier to check on the cow, which had been off her feed for 2 days, and had been in the lean to when the gray horse appeared on the trail. He stood with his hands loose at his sides and said nothing. Wentworth came up the creek trail from the south on the bay horse. He had been riding toward his camp from a meeting with the Burlington line foreman 14 miles down, and he had heard from Preston Daly 3 days earlier that a man on a gray horse had been asking questions about the Vance claim Clearwater Crossing, and he had adjusted his route accordingly. He drew up at the edge of the yard and did not dismount. He looked at Cornelius Vance with the level attention of a man accustomed to reading structural problems. Daly appeared behind Wentworth, riding the rangy sorrel, having come up from camp on a question about next week's supply run. He stopped beside Wentworth and looked at the Ojhaud's configuration and said nothing. Ruth Callahan came up the creek trail on foot with her youngest son beside her, carrying a jar of butter she had churned that morning and intended to bring by on her way to check her own snare line. She stopped at the yard's edge. She looked at Cornelius Vance with the specific expression of a woman who has buried one man to the inadequacy of his own heating arrangements and is not inclined toward charitable interpretation of other men's insufficiencies. She did not speak. Cornelius Vance looked at these four people who had entered the yard behind his daughter without announcement, without invitation, without anything that could be called coordination, except the coordination produced by a winter in shared country and the particular gravity of a situation that draws toward it the people who understand what the situation means. He looked at Ezra Holcomb, who had given his daughter an axe head and 3 pounds of salt pork, and the information that a dead man's knowledge had not died with him. He looked at Wentworth, who had ridden up a creek trail in December, prepared to tell her 4 things were wrong, and had ridden away carrying a different understanding of the word wrong. He looked at Daly, who had told a railroad company that a girl who survived what she had survived could feed 35 men without losing her composure. He looked at Ruth Callahan, who had pressed her hand against warm chimney stone and named the man who had designed what the stone contained. Then he looked past all of them, out across the Powder River Valley in the long September light, where if a man sat his horse at the right angle on the rise above the alcove and looked across the country to the east and south and north, he could count in the gold afternoon air 7 separate columns of smoke rising from 7 separate structures that had not existed in this valley a year ago. 7 Cachalofen, 7 families and cabins that would hold through what was coming. And what was coming was already apparent in the quality of the light, the way the big horns had begun to hold their snow above a certain elevation, the advanced signals of a Wyoming winter making its intentions known. Cornelius Vance looked at his daughter. She was standing in a clean apron at the door of a cabin she had built with Sharton Creek stone and a dead man's knowledge. And she was looking back at him without anger and without appeal, with the flat, attentive patience of a person who has already done the calculation and is waiting for the other party to arrive at the same result. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked once more at the 7 columns of smoke. He turned the gray horse. He rode south down the creek trail without speaking another word. And the dust from the horse's hooves rose in the September air, and the cottonwood leaves continued their unhurried descent. And the smoke from Adeline's chimney stack continued straight rise, and the yard was quiet. Wentworth touched the brim of his hat and turned the south, perhaps to confirm that the gray horse kept going in that direction, perhaps only to return the yard to the person it belonged to. Daly followed. Ezra put one hand on Adeline's shoulder for a moment, the weight of a large, weathered hand, brief and unambiguous, and took it away and walked around the side of the cabin toward the lean to finish checking the cow. Ruth Callahan crossed the yard and pressed the jar of butter into Adeline's hands without commentary and turned back toward the creek trail with her son beside her. The yard emptied. The smoke rose. Adeline stood at her cabin door in the long September light with the jar of butter in her hands and looked at the place on the trail where the gray horse had been. And then she went inside. She set the butter on the small table she had built in July from a split lodgepole and two bracket pieces of sandstone. She sat down beside the cachalofen. She pressed her back against the warm stone and looked at the closed firebox damper and thought about nothing in particular for a long time. About the smoke, about the 7 columns, about the gray horse going south, about a woman from Ohio who had said the cold is just the cold, about an old mason who had talked to the air and trusted it to remember. The air had remembered. She was sitting in the proof. She did not weep. She had wept enough for one season. The winter of 1882 into 1883 came down on the Powder River Valley with everything the bighorns had been accumulating since October. 7 Cachalofen burned through it. Not one family that had built to Adeline's design lost a person to the cold. The count grew: 11 by the winter of 1883, 19 by 1884, 31 by 1885. By the end of the decade, there were 46 masonry heaters in the valley and the surrounding drainage. And the mortality rate from cold in this part of Wyoming territory, which had run between 10 and 13% in the winters before the alcove cabin was built, had dropped below 2%. Children grew up in those cabins who would live into the next century. Old men died in their beds of causes unrelated to temperature. Infants who would have been buried in January were baptized instead in the following April. In the summer of 1884, Adeline used the wages from 2 seasons of railroad cooking to order firebrick from the Clearwater Crossing hardware supplier, who ordered it from Cheyenne, who sourced it through the Burlington line that had employed her the previous year. She also built a small clay firing kiln behind the alcove cabin and spent 6 weeks experimenting with the local clay composition, adjusting the mixture, testing fired samples against temperature and impact, until she had produced something that performed within acceptable tolerance of commercial firebrick. That autumn, she tore out the sandstone firebox she had built in December 1881, which had cracked as she had predicted it would and been reseeded twice, and rebuilt it with the fired clay tiles she had made herself. The heater ran from that point without a single firefox failure. Walter Dempsey arrived in the summer of 1885, land surveyor for the Wyoming territorial government, 29 years old, sent to document examples of frontier construction that had demonstrated unusual durability in the mountain climate. He had heard about the alcove cabin from 3 separate sources before he arrived: Wentworth's published article, a reference in a Burlington Company report, a mention in a territorial engineer's quarterly summary, and he had come prepared to spend a day measuring and sketching. He spent 3 days. He came back the following summer. He came back the summer after that. In the autumn of 1887, when Adeline was 22 years old, he asked her to marry him. She took 3 days to think about it, which she spent in the ordinary business of the cabin and the garden and the milk cow and the 2 families she was currently advising on heater hour construction 3 miles up the creek. On the 3rd day, she said yes, not because she needed the arrangement, but because Walter Dempsey was a man who looked at what she had built and understood it fully and did not require her to be smaller than she was in order to feel adequately sized standing beside her. That distinction, she had come to understand, was rarer than the surveyors and engineers who came through Wyoming territory might have suggested by their collective behavior. They were married in October at the cabin. Ezra Holcomb stood for her in the place her father had vacated. Wentworth sent a letter from his new posting in Denver that Walter read aloud during the toasts. A letter that was precise and brief and said, among other things, that he had described the alcove cabin to 100 men since December of 1881 and had not yet found one who, upon hearing the description, failed to understand what it meant. Ruth Callahan brought the wedding cake. Preston Daly sent from a survey camp in Idaho a silver dollar struck in 1881, mounted in a small wooden frame with a brass plate engraved, to Adeline Vance Dempsey on her wedding, the year the warmth began. Ezra Holcomb died in January of 1891 in his bed in the warmth of the cachalofen that he and Adeline had built together in the summer of 1882. He had come to visit the week before, sat with her by the heater and drank coffee, and said at some point during the conversation that Gustav would have been 74 this year. And then he had gone home, and 3 days later, his sister-in-law had ridden down the creek trail to tell her. There was no dramatic last scene. There was no final accounting. There was a man who had spent his life doing what needed doing, who had put a dead friend's name into a living girl's work at the moment when it mattered most, and who had then continued doing what needed doing for 9 more years, and who had died warm in his own bed, which was, Adeline thought, exactly the right way for Ezra Holcomb to end. She opened the school in 1889 in the front room of the cabin. She taught reading, figures, basic land law, animal husbandry. When the students were old enough, she taught them the principles of thermal mass and the mathematics of serpentine flue design. And she made them do the friction loss calculations by hand rather than copying her own results. Because the knowledge was not useful as a set of memorized answers and was extremely useful as a practice method of thinking about how physical systems behave. Her oldest daughter, Dorothy, named for no one Adeline named aloud, though Walter understood, grew up believing that all properly constructed houses were built into hillsides with stone heaters consuming a quarter of the back wall. Because every house she entered, in her first 12 years of life, been but that way, or was in the process of being rebuilt to that specification. Dorothy would write in a memoir, published decades later, that she had been past 20 before she encountered a conventional fireplace and had assumed immediately that the builder had made a serious technical error. Walter Tibby died in 1909, a fever contracted while surveying the headwaters of the North Platte in early spring when the snow was still deep at elevation, and the temperature differential between day and night was enough to constitute a medical risk that he had discounted in the interest of completing his survey on schedule. Adeline mourned him for 2 years. In the practical, non-demonstrative fashion she applied to most things, doing the work, maintaining the cabin, continuing the school, building or advising on the construction of 3 more heaters in the valley in the year immediately following his death, because the valley's children still needed warm rooms, and Walter being gone did not change the physics of the situation. She did not remarry. She raised the youngest of her 4 children to adulthood in the alcove cabin, which had by then grown outward from its original geometry into something that looked, from the rise above the creek, like a structure that had been there long enough to have become part of the hillside's own logic. 2 additional rooms, a proper root cellar, a smokehouse, a forge she had taught herself to operate in her late 30s when it became apparent that throughout the nearest blacksmith Fort Frontenac was too far away for see which she needed one. A reporter from the Cheyenne paper found her in 1921, sent to write a piece about surviving pioneers for the paper's anniversary supplement. He was 30 years younger than she was and had the particular combination of genuine curiosity and received opinions about frontier women that made him simultaneously interesting to talk to and occasionally in need of correction. He asked her how it had felt to survive at 16 what most people would have considered an impossible situation. She looked at him over the rim of her coffee cup in the warm front room of the cabin for a moment before answering. I didn't think about odds, she said. I thought about problems and solutions. I needed shelter. I found a hillside. I needed heat. I remembered an old man's drawings. I needed to survive. So I did the work. This country didn't care about my feelings or my age or what I was. It only cared whether I could learn fast enough and work hard enough. It turned out I could. He wrote it down word for word. It ran in the Sunday supplement and was reprinted twice in other Wyoming papers that month. And in 1953, the Wyoming Historical Society had it cut into a small bronze plaque, set into a stone at a roadside pullout on the ridge above the alcove site, where it could be read by anyone who stopped and got out of their vehicle and walked to the edge of the overlook. Adeline Vance Dempsey died in the winter of 1934, 69 years old, in the front room of the cabin she had built at 16 with a sharpened cremation stone and 4 pages of charcoal diagram. Her children buried her on the rise above the cabin beside Walter, under a marker she had cut for herself from a piece of the original sandstone foundation, the same formation she had pried from a crop a quarter-mile downstream in November of 1881, dragged to the alcove on a sledge of green willow branches, and fitted into the first course of the first wall she had ever built. She had cut the marker in her late 60s and kept it under her bed, the blank date awaiting the information it required. Her oldest son filled in the date with a chisel 3 days after the funeral. She built true, the stone said. Below her name, below the dates. Nothing else. The cabin stood until 1952. By then, the structure was 71 years old, and the National Forest Service, which had acquired the land in a transaction with the surviving heirs, had determined that the roof timbers were showing the first significant signs of fatigue, and that the structure presented a safety concern to hikers who might enter. Before the dismantling, they sent a masonry specialist named Laurel Harmon, a third-generation German-American who taught building construction at the Technical College in Laramie and had spent his career studying the history of masonry heating systems in the American West. Harmon spent 2 days inside the cabin with a notebook, a set of calipers, a tape measure, a brass plumb line, and the focused attention of a man who has spent his professional life reading structures the way other men read documents. He measured every dimension of the cachalothin. He calculated the cross-sectional ratios. He traced the serpentine channels and measured the bend angles with a protractor he had brought specifically for the purpose. He filed his report with the Forest Service in the spring. The serpentine flue channels, he wrote, were within 4% of optimal calculations for a structure of this interior volume-burning lodgepole pine at the altitudes characteristic of this drain. The firebox cross-sectional ratios were within 2% of the values that American engineering standards, first formally published in 1911, had arrived at through decades of systematic testing. The friction loss correction, expressed as additional stack height per horizontal foot of flue travel, was essentially identical to the formula those same standards contained. The wind collar was textbook in its geometry. The thermal mass to room volume ratio was, by the standards of the most current passive building research, ideal. Whoever built this structure, Harmon concluded, either possessed engineering knowledge that did not exist in documented form on the American frontier in 1881, or arrived at these solutions through empirical reasoning of a quality this specialist has rarely encountered in any structure of any era. There had been no engineering texts. There had been an old man drawing in the dust beside our wagon train fire, talking to the air because the air was all that was left to talk to, trusting that the air would hold what the people around him could not. There had been a girl in the shadows past the firelight's reach, knees pulled up under her chin, watching with the careful attention of someone who understood that what was being given away would not be offered again. The Forest Service dismantled the cabin in the autumn of 1952 and documented every stone. They preserved 3 slabs from the original chimney mass. The stones from the first course he had Adeline had built in December of 1881, the stones that had absorbed the heat of the first fire and held it through the first night and every night of the first winter, and every winter after that for 71 years. Those 3 stones are in a case at the Wyoming State Museum in Cheyenne, in a small room off the main gallery, with a brass plate on the case's front edge that gives the relevant names and dates and facts in the economical language of institutional record keeping. On summer afternoons, when the sun comes through the museum's south-facing windows at the angle that the afternoon produces between 2 and 4 o'clock, the light falls across the case and finds the stones inside it. They are warm to the touch through the glass. Not as warm as they once were, they have not held the heat of a real fire in a long time. And what they hold now is the accumulated warmth of summer afternoons filtered through a pane of museum glass, which is a different and lesser thing than what a lodgepole fire deposited in them across 7 decades of Wyoming winter. But they hold it. They hold it the way stone holds everything it has ever been given, not forever, but longer than the fire that provided it, longer than the hands that built the structure around it, longer than most of the things that people build to last. A man who lays his palm against the glass on one of those August afternoons can feel through the case the slow, patient warmth of stone that was once part of something larger. That is the only memorial Alan Vance ever asked for, in the sense that she never asked for any memorial at all, and this is what remains. She thought about problems and solutions. She did the work. The stone remembered.